Dr. Christopher Huffpower, the host of the Dear Doc podcast and also owner of The Business of Dentistry, the largest social media page in the entire world that is dentist only. I'm also a practicing dentist just like you. I own 2 practices in a small town 32 miles south of Houston called Alvin, Texas. Now I graduated in 2012 and by 2013 I started my scratch startup. Like a lot of you, I struggled a lot with systems and with case acceptance, and just really not knowing how to run a business. By 2019, I had managed to build that practice up to a $1.45 million collection practice, at which time I partnered with MB2. Now, I'm gonna tell you how I was able to do that working just 3 days a week out of 3 chairs. And I know that you're gonna be able to scale this into your practice and achieve the success that you really dream of, and that frankly you deserve. I'm going to share my secret recipes on how I talk to people, exactly which words to say, when to say them, and how to say them. More than that, we're going to cover the actual scientific basis behind influence, and I'm going to give you the benefit of the tens of thousands of dollars of training and consulting and CEs that I've had, and the countless hours of reading research papers and trying to develop my own take on exactly how to speak to patients to get them to go forward with treatment. After all, we have a moral obligation to ensure that our patients are in the best oral health possible. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Okay, before we make a deep dive into why people make the decision to buy and what things go into influencing that decision, I want to tackle the elephant in the room first. And that is, of course, that selling or sell is the 4-letter word of dentistry. It really should come as no surprise when the latest Gallup poll testing integrity, honesty, and ethics amongst professions ranks the 5 lowest as marketing salesperson, insurance salesperson, senator, congressman, and car salesman. Now, 3 of the 5 least trusted professions in our nation have the word sales in their name, and that should tell you something. I want to make sure that you understand my intention here, because as we always say at Doc's Edge Consulting, intention is the most important thing. My intention is not to turn you into car salesmen that happen to have a dental degree. My intention is to enable you to be trusted advisors to your patients, to know how to talk to them so that you can get them to agree to the treatments that will give them the optimal oral health that they both need and deserve. So why is selling a part of this? Can I just educate my patient? You can, and that does work for certain types of patient because that's what they desire. But finding out what kind of patient is in your chair and how to actually communicate with them is super important. Did you know that 75% of all treatment plans in dental offices today in the United States are never actually completed? What kind of a difference would it make if you were able to complete 75% of your treatment plans versus 25%? What kind of difference would it make in your practice? What kind of difference would it make in your patients' lives? So why selling? I want to introduce you to some concepts. You're going to see the net profit formula. And what that states is that revenues minus cost of goods sold is equal to your gross profit. And that gross profit minus general and administrative costs is equal to your net profit. Now, this is something that pretty much every business uses to determine where their costs are and to determine how they can become more profitable. So your cost of goods sold in general is your direct labor, your raw materials, your shipping, and things like that. It's what's required to manufacture the product. Your general admin costs is your overhead cost, your indirect labor, your facilities, your utilities, insurance, taxes, the cost of sales. So in dentistry, we use a slightly different model simply because it makes it more easily understood from our specific business. And that is called the practice productivity formula. Let's talk about that. The practice productivity formula says that the number of visits multiplied by the production per visit, multiplied by the percent that you collect from that production, minus your total overhead, is equal to profits. So what does that exactly boil down to? So your number of visits is going to be the total new patients that you have coming through your doors, your reappointed patients, your reactivated patients, your case acceptance patients, the ones who are coming in to get their work done. And reduced broken appointments also weigh into there as well. So in your production, the way that you can make your production go up is to increase your fees, reduce PPO dependency, expand your treatment plan, your treatment procedures, the types of things that you can do in your practice. I like to call them profit centers. You can diagnose needed treatment on a comprehensive basis, and you can increase your case acceptance. Now, it should be obvious at this point that the reason that I'd like to teach you a little bit more about the techniques and the philosophies and the science behind sales and influence is because we can directly increase our profits by increasing the production per visit. Hey folks, in this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the science of influence. So I've done a lot of research in this area. I've read a lot of books, a lot of research papers. My whole goal here is to keep you from having to read those same research papers and spend hours of time to pull the nuggets out of each one. And I have to say, whenever I read the work of early researchers that delved into the science of influence, I'm often reminded of a skit from an old Mel Brooks movie. You know, to set the scene, there's this long-bearded Moses. He emerges from a cave holding 3 tablets of stone with writing carved into them. And he holds them out and he says, "The Lord has given unto you these 15." And then he drops one of the tablets. And he looks down and looks at the rubble for a little bit. Then he looks back at the camera and goes, 10 commandments. But the point is that I kind of feel like researchers have done this in reverse, because as you read these papers, you know, first they found 4 things, and these were the 4 things, and then you found 5 things. In fact, some of the early papers were actually internally inconsistent. Like they would say in the title that there were 5 things, but in the paper they would list 7. And Robert Cialdini is the godfather of the psychology of influence and the science of influence. He's written several books, a ton of paper, and we're going to actually lean very heavily on his writings, but we'll also bring in some other early researchers just so that we can show some different perspectives.
Hear me! Oh, hear me! Oh, pay heed! The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 10 commandments!
Researchers have been studying the factors that influence us to say yes to the requests of others since about 1879. Now, currently, there can be no doubt that there is a science to how we're persuaded, and a lot of the evidence may surprise you. Now, don't get me wrong. The evidence isn't shocking. It isn't revolutionary. In fact, it's common sense. I'd be willing to bet that you already know a great deal about the science of influence. You just don't use it consciously. As a matter of fact, Harvard neuroscientist and business school professor Dr. Gerald Zaltman claims in his research that 95% of our decision-making processes are made on a subconscious and emotional level. What we call logic only gets applied to those decisions after we've made them in an attempt to maintain consistency with our idea that we're logical beings. And we're going to talk more about that later on whenever we cover the principles of influence. When making a decision, it'd be nice to think that people consider all the available information. I mean, as dentists, we spend all of our time educating patients. The reality is often very different. In increasingly overloaded lives that we have today, more than ever, we need shortcuts or rules of thumb to guide our decision making. Understanding these shortcuts and employing them in an ethical manner can significantly increase your chances of persuading someone to do what you're asking them to do. I want you to think about whenever you are looking at something that you're buying on Amazon and you see something has 1,200 5-star reviews, and you see another product that looks exactly the same to you. It's got 1 4-star review. Now, it'd be a pretty good bet that you're going to buy that 5-star review product, even if it's $5 or $10 more than the product with the 4 stars. And the reason is you used a rule of thumb or a cheat or a shortcut. You used the experiences that others have already had with that product, so you wouldn't have to research what made those 2 products different and what made one better than the other. And we do this every single day in our lives. And the reason I'm telling you this story and giving this example is because I want you to really do a deep dive into thinking about how these principles of influence affect you. Because the more you see that it happens to you as a logical, smart person, the more you're going to understand the profound effect that it can have on your communication with your patients, your team, and even your family. Okay guys, buckle up. In this next segment, we're going to go and cover every single one of the individual principles of influence as taught by Dr. Robert Cialdini. We're going to be following along pretty much chapter by chapter. In fact, I've named each section after the chapter in his new book, or the reprinting I should say. And that is Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. Now, if you look in the files that we've given you, I actually managed to download a copy in PDF format of both Influence and his second book, Persuasion, from ResearchGate. Now, they're older copies of the book, and they may not be in exactly the same order, but they'll still benefit you greatly. If you do find benefit of them, please buy his books, because you got value from it. His second book is Persuasion. Persuasion, a revolutionary way to influence and persuade. So, in this section, we're going to cover a lot of examples of real-life reciprocity. We're going to talk about how you can use reciprocity in your own office. And we're going to talk about how the knowledge of reciprocity itself may allow you to resist being taken in by scams and things like that. I hope you enjoy the section. Let's go ahead and get into it. According to sociologists and anthropologists, one of the most widespread and basic norms of human culture is embodied in the rule of reciprocation. In fact, research has shown that the rule of reciprocation is present throughout human society across the world. It seems to be absolutely ubiquitous. Now, the rule requires that one person repay in form or in kind what another person has provided to them. By obligating the recipient of an act to repayment in the future, the rule allows for one individual to give something to another with confidence that it is not being lost. This sense of future obligation within the rule makes it possible for the development of various kinds of continuing relationships, transactions, and exchanges that are beneficial to society. Consequently, all members of societies are trained from childhood to abide by the rule or suffer from serious social disapproval. I want you to think about some of the words that we use to describe people negatively. Freeloader, leech, gold digger. These are all horrible words. Whenever you say them, you hear them, you get this awful connotation. And why? Because it's a person who's broken the social contract by taking that which was not theirs and giving nothing in return. So we can see that this is kind of ingrained in us. As children, we're taught to say please and thank you. More on please later, because there's some really interesting news on that whenever it comes to reciprocity. But these are basic behaviors that we're taught as children. If somebody gets you a Valentine's Day card, you're supposed to give them one. Whenever you're a kid, you're supposed to give everybody in the class a Valentine's Day card, on the off chance that they're giving you one as well, because you don't want to be the rude kid who shows up with nothing and gets Valentine's Day cards from everybody else. You'd be an absolutely heel. You'd be a social pariah. So it's interesting how this is mixed into our society. When you think really deeply about it, it makes a lot of sense. If you think about a hunter and gatherer society where great amounts of labor were spent to forage so that you could get food. Well, let's say that you, in your village, you were able to secure lots of acorns. This is actually a real example from the northeast of the United States. So you had these acorn forests, right? Well, you might travel miles and miles to the seacoast to trade your acorns for salt that people got that was dried off of the sands, or for fish, or salted fish even. And so if you were to bring them your berries or your acorns or what have you and say, hey, here's my berries or my acorns, and they gave you nothing in return, well, it would completely keep you and your family or your tribe from ever doing that again. So this basic rule of reciprocity is actually speculated by anthropologists and sociologists to be the cornerstone of society. They say that society probably couldn't exist if we didn't have reciprocity in place. You know, it's interesting to me. The decision to comply with another's request is frequently influenced by the reciprocity rule. You know, one favorite and profitable tactic of certain compliance professionals is to give something before asking for a return favor. Exploiting this tactic is due to three characteristics of the rule. The first one is that because it's such an ingrained part of our society, it's super, super powerful. It often overwhelms other factors that normally would determine compliance with the request. I mean, you don't even have to like someone to be compliant with their request if it's made in a way that creates reciprocity. And we're going to look at some studies later and some case studies about how we can show that that actually happens. So the second part of the rule of reciprocity that makes it even more powerful is that the rule applies even whenever the favor that created it was uninvited. That reduces our ability to decide who it is we wish to owe and puts the choice in the hands of others. And finally, the rule can spur unequal exchanges. To be rid of the uncomfortable feeling of being in debt to someone else, an individual often agrees to a request that is substantially larger than the favor that they received originally. And regarding those last two rules, the unasked for favors and the fact that reciprocity can provide an even greater result than the gift that was given, or one that is out of keeping with the size of the original gift, is something I remember from my childhood. A magazine publisher called Publishers Clearinghouse used to send out every single year this thing of stamps, and it was this just a bunch of stamps in different colors and in different designs and styles, but they had your address on them. And the whole idea was you could take these self-addressed stamps and you could stick them on your envelopes and you wouldn't have to write out your address. Now, they'd always come out around Christmas time, so you're in the spirit of giving, right? And the package was really kind of masterful whenever you think about it in the terms of reciprocity. The first thing they said is, this is our free gift to you during this holiday season. We hope that you'll find some of our offerings to be interesting. Please pick up to 5 magazines from this list to receive a free trial subscription. What later goes on to say that that trial subscription becomes a real subscription after the first copy of the magazine gets to you. And so it was interesting that instead of please pick whatever magazines you want, they said up to 5. So they added scarcity there, right? Which was kind of clever. They added reciprocity with their free gift, but they also capitalized on those last two rules of reciprocity, because we hadn't asked for this package of stamps, had we? It was an unasked for gift. And then they wanted us to buy magazines, which were like $45 or $50 for each year subscription. They wanted you to buy up to 5 of them. So you're looking at $250 if someone did their maximum number of magazines that they could select under this special offer. And so you're looking at a 5-cent sheet of address stamps and a $250 sale for the company. You know, whenever you look at the third rule of why the reciprocity portion of influence is so important and so powerful. It's that reciprocity can engender a repayment that's much larger than the original debt was to begin with. There's one study that showed that they had this guy in a room, and he is presumptively in this study with another person, and they're supposed to be critiquing art. Well, in reality, the study was actually a study of reciprocity and its effect upon individuals who didn't know each other. So the guy would leave for the break, and he would come back with a Coke or not come back with a Coke. And he would give one Coke to the other person and say that he got it for him because they looked thirsty, and he'd keep his Coke himself. And the other one, he didn't bring anything back. No Coke for him, no Coke for them. And what they found is that later, when he hit them up to ask them if they'd buy raffle tickets, that they would buy an enormous amount of raffle tickets, sometimes up to 500 times the value of the original gift of that Coca-Cola. So you can see that whenever you cause somebody to feel obligation toward you, their receptiveness toward a sale or an agreement or compliance to your desires goes up far more than it otherwise would have, and more than you should really reasonably expect. Another way that reciprocity works in our everyday lives is actually kind of a twist on the basic theme of reciprocity. And that is, when you ask someone for something, if they refuse your request, you can then follow up with a second request that's somewhat smaller, somewhat easier for them to make. And most of the time, they will do whatever it is they're asked to do in that second request. The author actually gives an example of a Boy Scout that comes up to him, and he says, "Sir, would you like to buy one of my raffle tickets for $5? And the author says, "I didn't want a raffle ticket." So I told the kid no. So the kid follows up with, "Well, then would you mind buying one of my $1 candy bars?" The author bought 2 of them. And he said, on reflection, walking away from the kid, it struck him that this was an unforeseen, unstudied side effect of reciprocity, because he didn't like chocolate and he did like money, but now he was walking away from the kid and he had 2 chocolate bars and $2 less. We mentioned earlier that if you know the levers of influence, if you know how they're used, then you can defend against them, and you can not be as influenced by them as you otherwise would have. Some studies have been done into exactly how to do this with the rule of reciprocity. So what they found is contrary to what I did, because once I learned about it, I just stopped taking gifts from everybody. You know, if a rep would offer to take me out to lunch, I would snag the bill, because it put him in a sense of reciprocity toward me. And I'm telling you guys, when you're negotiating for equipment, do exactly this. It completely blows their mind. It flummoxes them. So that's the tact I took. But the studies have shown an actual better tact is to accept the gift, but label it in your head as a possible trick. So accept it as a gift, but kind of, be a little bit wary. And on the hind end, if it does turn out to be a trick that they're employing so that they can influence you into doing something, you can immediately relabel it in your brain as a deceptive tactic, and it actually gives you an advantage in the negotiation because they were deceiving you. So I guess the moral of the story is go ahead and take your reps free lunches when they offer them. So our next principle of influence that we're going to cover is liking. Now, I know this is going to be a huge surprise to everyone. People like doing business with people they like. I know it doesn't blow anyone's head up. The thing is recognize this rule so that you can increase your likability. There are several different things that can increase your likability to others. One is physical attractiveness. Now, it's long been suspected that physical attractiveness had some effect in sales, or some effect in the ability to influence others. But recent studies have brought to light that the effect is far, far greater than we ever suspected it was. So that's one thing. And, obviously, if you're born with an ugly mug like mine, maybe the best that you can do is dress professionally, dress nicely whenever you speak to your patients or what have you. But everything that we can do to increase our appearance will also increase our likability. As a result, attractive people are more persuasive, both in terms of getting what they request and in changing other people's attitudes. So definitely something that can be of benefit. A second factor that influences liking and compliance is similarity. We like people who are like us, okay? And so we're more willing to say yes to their requests, often in an unthinking manner. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. Whenever you're talking to a patient, one of the first things that I do is I ask them what they do for a living. And I do that for a couple of different reasons. The first one is because if I know what they do for a living, there's a good chance, because of all the different jobs I've had in my life, that I've done something that is, 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon from what they've done in their life or what they professionally do right now. And I'll be able to speak to them in language that is common to those trades, or I'll know analogies to use to explain dental treatments in a way that I know that they're going to get. So that's one reason. The other reason is knowing what someone does currently for a profession, or knowing what they did before they retire, allows you to find some commonality there that interests may cross, or where interests do cross, where you can relate to the patient in a more one-on-one personal way than just, being their provider, being their dentist. I found that very, very helpful in my own practice. So the third thing that can really enhance your likability to a person is giving them praise. Genuine compliments generally enhance liking and hence compliance. Now, it cannot be stressed enough that the compliments have to be genuine. Another thing to think about is that the more a person thinks that the compliment is sincere, the more weight it has whenever they're looking at you as a person. If, for example, you actually give that compliment not to the patient, but to their spouse, behind their back, so to speak, then that actually gives much more credence to the fact that that is a genuine compliment. Let's say I'm in the room with a husband or a wife, and the wife goes to the restroom or what have you, and she's my patient. And I say, you know what? I really, really like that color on her. Most of us guys are just going to be like, oh, okay. But we might tell the wife later, oh, yeah, the dentist was flirting. He said he liked that color on you. But it makes the person feel flattered. I try to pay really close attention whenever I'm talking to patients to the way that they dress, to their hairstyle. Now, I have to admit, I grew up with 3 sisters, and they tormented me horribly if I did not notice something that they had done with their hair or their nails, or if they had new shoes or a new blouse. And so I may be more keyed into it than most guys are, but it's always so amazing how flattering it is to the patient when I look at her and I say, Miss Wilson, are those new shoes? How did you notice? Well, I remember you were wearing those orange ones last time. I really like those. Those look really nice with your dress. You won't believe the amount of response you'll get from patients from that. So the fourth thing that influences whether or not people like you is your rapport with them, or the amount of time that you spend with them. Obviously, the amount of time that you spend with them under positive circumstances rather than negative circumstances. But what's really, really interesting here, and there's kind of a positive feedback loop, is the longer that you spend with someone, the more they like you. But the more they like you, the more your rapport builds. And so it's interesting how once you've begun gathering rapport, unless you do something horribly wrong, that rapport continues to snowball. Now, this is seen very, very easily whenever you look at your patients who don't complete their treatment immediately. You'll notice that at about 1 year or a year and a half or 2 years, they'll all of a sudden start doing all their treatment. Now, it's not because something magical suddenly happened and they have more money or whatever. It's that you've built up enough rapport that they trust you implicitly, and they're hearing those things over and over and over again at every single 6-month visit or 3 or 4 months visit for our perio patients. And it's finally sinking in. But the thing is, they have the rapport with you now that they can trust you enough to go forward with the treatment. So that's one of those cool little kinks of influence that's kind of neat. Now, the fifth factor is being liked by linking or by association. When we associate ourselves with products or things that the patient views in a positive manner, whether that be a sports team, or if it is a church, or if it is a hobby, those things also increase our liking because we are more alike. I actually kind of think this folds into the second rule, where we like people who are similar to us, but that's definitely something that that they cover in the book that very much works, is specifically linking yourself to things that have a very positive value associated with them. Now, we talked a little bit earlier on in this segment about how we were going to avoid falling victim to these same tactics of persuasion. You remember I mentioned the influence professionals, aka salesmen, right? So one of the things that you can do here is simply to kind of be on your guard. And when you're doing business dealings with someone, to kind of do an internal gut check. And if you find yourself liking them just over the top, take a step back. I believe in management by statistics in my practice. And the reason I do is because it removes emotion from business decisions. And so in order to fall back from that being sucked into the liking principle, if you just cut off your emotions whenever it comes to a business deal, very stark, okay, cool, let's talk about business now. That will be of great benefit for you. The next principle of influence that we're going to delve into is social proof. Now, in its most base form, social proof just means that people look to the opinions of others to inform their own opinions and actions. It's been found to have powerful effects among both children and adults in such diverse activities as purchasing decisions and charity donations, even phobia remission. The principle of social proof can be used to stimulate a person's compliance with a request by showing them that other people also are complying with that request. In fact, the more that those people are like them, the more likely it is that they're going to comply. So it can actually piggyback on top of liking. Social proof is the most influential under 3 conditions. The first one is uncertainty. When people are unsure, when the situation is ambiguous, they are likely to attend to the actions of others to inform their own actions. In ambiguous situations, for instance, the decisions of passersby to offer emergency aid are much more influenced by the actions of other bystanders than when a situation is a clear-cut emergency. So let's say, for instance, there's a guy who's laying on the side of the sidewalk, okay? And everyone's passing by him. What they have found in social experiments is that the crowd will simply pass by this guy and no one will stop to help. Now, if you plant one person who's bending over to help, all of a sudden it'll attract a crowd of people. And the more people that do that, the more people will go. So that's kind of an interesting concept there. It says some dark things about the human soul, I think. The second condition under which social proof is extremely powerful is whenever there are large numbers of people doing something. Anytime that there's a large cohort of people doing something, that action seems more correct or valid, more socially acceptable, or more feasible. I mean, think about the waves of things that we've had go on that you think to yourself, why would anyone eat a Tide Pod? Or why would anyone drink bleach? Why would anybody go out and get horse ivermectin instead of going to their doctor to get ivermectin if their doctor prescribes it? And the truth of the matter is that is kind of the dark side of social proof. When a whole bunch of people are doing something dumb, it's like lemmings running off the edge of a cliff. The third condition under which social proof is very powerful, is similarity. We kind of touched upon that a little bit earlier whenever we said, hey, there's lots of other people doing this and they're just like you. The more principles of influence you can stack on top of each other in something, the more powerful the message becomes and the more influential it becomes. So evidence for a powerful influx of actions of similar others can be seen in suicide statistics that have been compiled by David Phillips, a suicidologist. Anytime that a suicide makes the national news, or anytime a school shooting makes the national news, anyone who identifies with that person is much, much more likely to commit suicide themselves if they were on the fence, or to go on some sort of killing rampage. It's simply the sad side of our society and our 24-hour news cycle. It's why a lot of news organizations have stopped covering suicide. I wish they'd stop covering the school shootings as well, but it's kind of their function these days, I suppose. Now, in social proof, it's a big mistake that many communicators make. Is they actually decry the frequency with which something happens. And since you guys out there are all getting really, really smart about social influence and about the principles of influence, I know that you're thinking, well, if you're saying a bunch of other people are doing it, they get on the Me Too bandwagon. And that's exactly what happens. They find that there's big blooms of suicide activity and things like that when newscasters or talking heads start bringing up how many people are doing it. It has the opposite effect that's intended. It actually increases the number of people doing whatever that behavior is. So what do you do if you don't have any social proof? Well, one thing that you can do is you can cash in on future social proof. And the way that Dr. Cialdini describes that is basically you talk about honest trending factors. Like, this past week we've had 5 people sign up. That doesn't mean that you have hundreds of people have done it. You can't honestly say, remember, honesty is one of our big policies here whenever it comes to the principles of influence. You can't say hundreds of people have signed up for my dental savings plan. But what you can say is this past week, we've had 5 people just like you sign up for this. I think it's a really great decision. So one of the ways that you can manufacture social proof is by trends, but do it honestly. The last thing we're going to talk about on this subject is our recommendations for avoiding social proof influence. And that basically comes down to realizing that you are being influenced by social media. And when you see a claim that appears false, assume it's false and fact check it.